Hello, I'm Shannon Hopkins, one of the co-founders of Rooted Good, and co-hosting this season of Igniting Imagination with me is my colleague, Mark Elston. Hey, Mark.
Hi there, Shannon.
Our theme this season is Properties with New Purpose. We believe this is a profound moment for the church. It's a moment full of opportunity. However, the way forward isn't always clear to congregations, and there are so many questions. How did we get here? Why is all this talk about development happening? What about things other than housing? While there are many questions, we're bringing you amazing stories of churches, pastors, and leaders that are showing a new way forward. Congregations that are redeveloping their land, CDCs that have started, places that are launching social enterprises, communities that are serving their neighbors in new ways. We want to introduce you to these pastors and leaders that are stepping out. Their stories are phenomenal, and their work is helping to lay a path into a new and good future for the church and for the world.
Our question for this episode is, why and how is community development work the work that the church should be doing? Joining us is Joe Bowling, who is the executive director of Englewood Community Development Corporation, which was born out of Englewood Christian Church in Indianapolis. Englewood Community Development Corporation, or CDC, has launched over 100 projects or programs spanning all facets of housing, economic development, early childhood education, sports leagues, green space creation, food access, and so much more. We'll get into some of that in our conversation today. There's a lot of talk out there about doing this kind of work and about churches developing their property and churches investing in their neighborhoods and churches getting involved in economic development. But it is not always easy to find people who've really done that work, who've actually done it and done it for many, many years and lived it day in and day out, literally living in a neighborhood and literally living with neighbors and creating these projects as a response to those relationships. Joe is one of those people that has lived it and done it. And so we're really excited to have this conversation with Joe. But before we do, Shannon, what are some of the things that really stuck out to you about our conversation with Joe?
Oh my gosh. I love the humility that Joe came into this conversation with. He really talked about the deep work that it takes, and he didn't approach it like we have all the answers. He said, here's some of the best practices, but it's not like this is the way you have to do it. There's just so much humility. And the other thing that really struck me was like the way he started to talk about the church and the land of the church as the demonstration plot, that it's demonstrating kind of that new economy. It's demonstrating love of neighbor. And I loved it. I mean, I could have talked to him for hours. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, he really emphasized the pace, that this stuff takes some time and that it takes relationship, that it takes really engaging with people in a true way. I think he really painted a picture of how you don't set out to come up with a solution or come up with a building or take a model off a shelf and put it on your property, but you start with relationship and you start with listening, deep listening, and you just go from there. And you don't have sort of an outcome in mind necessarily as you begin. You just respond to the way God is moving and the way your community is moving. And that, I think, is really quite powerful. And of course, it's led to some amazing outcomes in their community and with their church and with their CDC. But they didn't set out to sort of become big or become famous or become anything. They just did the next thing and the next right thing with the people that they were living with.
That's right. Oh, yeah. So let's let everyone listen.
All right, let's dive in.
Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. As you know, in this podcast, we're talking about the moment the church is facing across the U.S. as it engages with the opportunities and challenge related to building and land use. There have been a ton of stories in the media about churches closing, churches selling, and churches doing new development on their land. But you come to us with decades of experience rooted in the local church in Indianapolis, and you've spearheaded a number of developments around the church property. Before we get into all of that, I'd love you to just start by talking about what started it all. Where are you? Tell us about your neighborhood, and what's the story of Englewood Christian Church?
I'd be glad to, and thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be with you, and hope this is a good conversation. I know I always learn more from just interacting with you, with Mark, and others. So, yep, glad to be with you. So I'm Joe Bowling. My role is as executive director for the Englewood Community Development Corporation, and ECDC, as we call it, is an outgrowth and a separate 501c3, but very much connected to Englewood Christian Church that has been rooted at 57 North Rural Street since about 1895. We sometimes say it was on Rural Street when rural was actually rural, it's about 2 miles outside of the central business district of downtown. So very much a downtown church, and a church that has been every kind of church and every kind of context over the last 120. What would that be? 29 years now. So was certainly a church planted way far out on the sort of outside of the city limits of Indianapolis. Was then in a more suburban context as buildings like the church building started to pop up in the early parts of the 20th century, homes around it, including around our Englewood neighborhood, and then became more of a blue-collar neighborhood as suburbs were built, etc., and then has been a very pronounced kind of urban context over the last 50 or so years. But the church has been here for about 129 years. I would say that it at one point in the 50s was the largest Protestant church in the city of Indianapolis. And I think the second largest of our sort of Stone Campbell kind of Christian Churches of Christ tradition in the United States. So grew very large and was kind of a mega church before mega churches were cool, kind of a thing. But when disinvestment and suburbanization started to happen in the 60s and 70s, even though the church was still quite large with over 1,000 members, etc., began to shrink pretty quickly, and as folks started to move out of the neighborhood. And so I would say from the late 70s, early 80s, and certainly the 90s, when my family moved to Indianapolis and to Englewood in about 1993, was certainly a church that a lot of people would consider both a church and within a kind of a neighborhood that were certainly in decline of about 300 or so folks at that point. What attracted my dad and my mom to Englewood? My dad was called to be senior pastor in 1993. I was in high school at the time. Our family moved from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Indianapolis and to Englewood. Is that he certainly was impressed with maybe some things that the church was already doing to kind of engage the neighborhood in some significant ways. I would say by 1995, 1996 or so, there was a really good conversation, though, about the shape of some of those activities and just the recognition that a lot of those activities were happening with a membership that was very incongruent with the surrounding neighborhood and context. And so, again, this is not to speak poorly about kind of that generation of Englewood Christian Church as folks that I'm still friends with and folks that I still love, and a lot of activity that I really, really see as good activities. But the reality is that at that point in time, there were maybe only a handful of older ladies, widows, that still resided within kind of the Englewood neighborhood around the congregational facility and sort of the broader Near East Side community that we consider ourselves a part of. And so we just kind of recognize that, that kind of way of being in the neighborhood with a congregation that was in an urban context, but really more of a suburban membership and mentality, it just wasn't going to be sustainable over the long term. And so there was a good conversation while I was in college. So I was not a party to a lot of these early conversations. My dad, my father-in-law, others really drove and participated in these with a broad base of Englewood folks, just about what the future might look like, and just the reality that, and again, so I will just say they were introduced to a lot of Christian teaching and books and new ways of thinking that really started to identify the church as first family, as church, as a real community. And they made space within the church, especially on a Sunday night, to have conversations, slow conversations, week after week, Sunday night after Sunday night, about the shape of the church, about the place within the neighborhood. And that took many years, but there became a growing consensus after 2 or 3 years anyway, that if folks were open to kind of moving back into the Englewood neighborhood, there would likely be some benefit from that, from the ability to kind of create some community together, to share lawnmowers, to share meals, to decide on childcare together, to maybe even develop some common work strategies together. So in the mid-90s, late 90s or so, there were a lot of those active conversations about the shape of the church and about our place in the neighborhood, or lack of a place in the neighborhood, even though there were some ministry activities that were kind of sort of impressive at the time. So again, my mom and dad, in about 1994 or so, about a year in, moved back into the neighborhood, just a couple blocks away from the church building, and more folks started to do likewise. And so I was in college at the time, and by 1998, when my wife and I kind of left college and were getting married, many younger families like myself both decided to move into the neighborhood, but there were just a lot of Englewood folks that kind of came to me and said, beyond just living in the neighborhood, would you really consider your vocation and what you're learning in school and what you might learn after school, and really consider what you might do and the gifts that you might be developing as a vocation and a gift back to kind of the Englewood neighborhood, etc. That was really appealing to me, and it was really appealing to a lot of other younger families at the time. And so not only did many of us start to move in kind of the late 90s or so, but we really started to think, what are the skills that we're developing, and how are those skills? And for myself, I was really involved, and I was really drawn to real estate, and I was really drawn to kind of real estate development. And I had no imagination for what that might look like relative to serving in kind of a poor neighborhood, etc. But again, folks around here kind of helped me with that imagination, etc. So there were folks kind of moving in. I think that was the first thing, kind of the late 90s or so. But then they also started a couple of different offshoots or ministries or nonprofits, one being Daystar Childcare, which is now also about 27, 28 years old, with 40 teachers serving about 175 kids from about 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. That's really grown and been a wonderful way to engage with our surrounding neighbors. But then they also started a separate 501c3 called Englewood Community Development Corporation to really house a lot of the kind of neighborhood-facing activities, but to still do that kind of in the context of the church. So I think a lot of times kind of think of those three things of kind of moving back in, and then actually kind of starting a couple of different expressions of the church like Daystar and Englewood CDC or ECDC that have really given us the chance to be more involved in a significant way.
So I love it. I love the rich history. And I've been to Englewood, and I know how much you and your family love the neighborhood. I just would love for you to say, what's it look like today with the work that Englewood Community Development Corporation is doing? Like, talk about the breadth of your work that's rooted there on transforming the neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, we certainly don't think that it's on us to transform the neighborhood, right? Like we certainly see that a lot of that this work is God's work of reconciliation, and as He's reconciling all things. And we certainly recognize that we're just one of a host of partners that we work with to just sort of seek the common good and to kind of do the work that we do in the neighborhood. And so don't want this to be, completely about just what we do. But we do a lot of different things now. And again, 27 years is a long time. And so you just build up kind of a knowledge base and some relationships, etc. So let me just say, for the first 10 or so years, most of the activity of Englewood CDC from 1997 to 2006 or so was really more internal, and it was focused on building a real kind of community, both within the church and sort of around the church, helping folks to move back into the neighborhood if they really wanted to move into the neighborhood, but to not do that with a posture of, we know better than you, we've come to fix things, etc. So most of what we did was pretty internal to kind of Englewood Church. It was really just kind of helping young families like myself and others move into the neighborhood, get their homes fixed up, lending to one another, not really with church funds and not really with grant funds. It was really just sort of like, I could get a second mortgage on my house and a little equity, and we could kind of pair that with 2 or 3 others that could get a second mortgage, etc., and just find ways to kind of get one another into home ownership around the church, and then look for spaces where we could join neighborhood conversations and help and learn in some very, very humble ways. That was the first decade or so. And it was really more internal, and it was really more focused on home ownership, because a lot of us were seeking home ownership and forming households at that time. But again, after a decade or so, you live in a place, you really get to know where folks struggle and how folks are different from you and from what you've had access to, etc., that you just kind of recognize not everyone has those same opportunities, and perhaps not everyone is going to be a homeowner, and even housing is just not the be all end all. There's other aspects of neighborhood life and quality of life. And so pretty quickly after a decade or so, recognize that for us to be a more comprehensive community, you have to care about a lot of different things. And it doesn't mean you have to do everything, but you at least have to care about it. And you at least have to see how those things kind of connect together in tangible ways. So we did, and we had an early start in this, but we did actually inherit from Englewood Church as Englewood CDC about 7 or so homes that initially were owned either for pastoral staff to live in, when it was still like acceptable for pastoral staff to live in kind of the neighborhood, and that was what they wanted. By the 60s and 70s, the church staff didn't want to live in the neighborhood. It was no longer a good neighborhood. So we inherited a number of properties and started to find folks within the congregation that needed affordable rental housing to live in some of these homes. And so we started managing a few of these properties that we inherited from the church, and getting to know in a deeper way some of the church members that we probably should have known a little bit better as a congregation, but just simply didn't. And so got a little bit of a start in doing some affordable rental housing, kind of in that first, half or so of our existence. And then I will just kind of say that as we started to build some capacity and kind of peek our heads out into neighborhood conversations a little bit, we just recognized that there was certainly a greater need, not just for home ownership development, but for affordable rental housing for people that really struggle or are vulnerable in a number of ways. So that has certainly become one of the bigger aspects of what we do today. So just to kind of jump to 2024, I would say by the middle of next year, we'll have, I think, 12 different apartment buildings that have about 420 families that we kind of manage as affordable rental housing. About a quarter of those coming from chronic homelessness into permanent supportive housing. Another portion for refugee families, as we've kind of helped our local refugee resettlement organization locate just a couple blocks away from us. And so a lot of interaction with refugee families, certainly a couple of different developments that serve exclusively seniors. One development that we just completed about a year ago that serves persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it's become a little bit more of a bread and butter for us to develop and then manage and provide some critical services and affordable housing to very vulnerable populations. But we do a whole host of other things like the Englewood Review of Books, some economic development and job creation, childcare, kind of as I mentioned, and we continue to still do home ownership and home ownership development.
That's amazing.
I'm struck by a number of things, Joe, that are just super interesting about this story. I mean, it took you quite a while to get to, both in this telling of it and in the reality of it, actually, to get to the sort of scale you're at now, which is quite big. I mean, I think I don't want to kind of pass over that. I mean, 420 families, that's a lot. That's a lot that's going on there. And that's just the housing portion of what you do. As you said, you have all these other things. But what's interesting, well, one of the things that's interesting about that, though, is the way in which you did it. It took quite a long time, right? I mean, in an intentional method and an intentional growth, and you actually started on a much more modest scale. I mean, maybe could you talk a little bit about kind of that journey? And then, you know, we encounter a lot of churches that they see this idea of doing affordable housing or whatever, and they just sort of like want to jump from nothing to like, you know, a 10-story building. And there's this whole thing in between that you have begun to uncover as sort of, you know, I mean, moving into there's so many layers to that, but what sort of your reflections on that?
Well, I guess I was going to say thank you, Mark, for kind of that prompt. And it does take me a long time to maybe get to where we are in 2024 for a couple of reasons, like you said. I mean, number one, we're not really that impressed by the size and scale of our work at this point, because it really is more about how others in the broader community and other communities are trying to serve in their communities. And I think what we've discerned over the years, working with a lot of younger groups, as you kind of mentioned, or churches that want to do likewise, sometimes the number of buildings or the size of buildings that we're kind of working with now become a bit of a distraction, and it becomes overwhelming for churches that are just sort of like, what's the right next step for us? And so, yeah, a big 4-story building with 50 apartment units is probably not the right next step. And you know, so kind of showing that and touting that is maybe just kind of not that helpful. So, I mean, as you're saying, I think for us, just some of those initial steps were sort of like hanging drywall and drinking beer and watching each other's kids, you know, in living rooms, and working on each other's houses and deciding who's going to bring what for dinner that evening, etc. And you know, there's a community meeting, you know, who can go and represent us and maybe make a contribution, etc. Those are really just kind of humble and daily ways of being community. And I think that's what it is for most folks. And that's really what it should be. And I think that does provide the practice and the DNA for kind of doing more, you know, over time. I mentioned it before, but I think just a critical thing for us was for at least a significant number of folks to maybe make a commitment, and a significant commitment, back to this neighborhood. I think there are certainly some ways that a lot of Englewood Church ministry activity could have moved forward with us just sort of driving in from the suburbs, and certainly a lot of churches do that, and there's some really good work that happens, and a lot of needs that get met, etc. But I think we've just kind of come to you know, to on one hand, you know, affirm some of that and recognize that a lot of times that is really good work, but the kind of community building and being a real community that I think the church is called to as sort of a demonstration plot of what's possible with relationships and what's possible with economy and what's possible kind of with community. I think it can only really happen if at least some folks are living around wherever your home base is, whether it's with a congregational facility or not, and around one another, and to kind of get some practice in terms of what healthy community and healthy relationships will sort of look like. for us, one signature story that we will often talk about is we had an elderly lady within the church named Donna, and Donna never made more than minimum wage, and Donna's husband had left her. She was raising a teenage son, and Donna asked for some folks in the church to kind of help her move. And we said, sure, Donna, where can we help you move? And she just was being evicted. She had no place to go, but she just knew that she needed to move. And I think a lot of us in the church and at the time were kind of caught flat-footed to say, hey, this is a senior woman that had been part of our congregation for 30 or so years, and there was just very little that we could offer to help other than moving if she found a place to kind of move to. And so we began to work with Donna and identified a burned out home that the city of Indianapolis owned. We bought it for $1,000. We began a plan to renovate it and showed up on Saturdays and a couple times during the week, etc., and to get her ready for home ownership. And so this woman that was a single mom and had never made more than minimum wage, after a year or two, lived in one of those kind of rental units that the church had given to us, and then kind of moved into her own home. And that was a really, really big step for us. I mean, our whole universe and agenda for what would become Englewood CDC was really kind of focused on Donna and focused on her housing situation. So again, just a singular stories like that of just kind of working with one person like her has been kind of the repeatable kind of practices that we've tried to work on here for 27 or so years.
You're describing not a solution, not a model. You're describing an outgrowth of relationship. I mean, and you're describing a sort of a following of the lead of of the Holy Spirit, you might say, and of the people that you're in a relationship with. It's a really quite a different framing, honestly, of this work, right? It's not like, okay, here's the answer, or it's just simply, what are people living with, and how do we respond to that? I mean, that's a really different approach. When you talk a lot, you've been talking a lot about moving into the neighborhood, which is, I mean, that's a hard step for people. Like, what would you say? This might be difficult for you to answer, but what would you say to folks in churches that are trying to do this work, but that are not intending to move into the neighborhood, or that have, no plans to do that, don't know how to do that, don't know how to begin, and maybe frankly won't? Are there ways they can still do this work genuinely, or not? Or like, how does it get done? Or what? Or if they could, how would you suggest they go about it?
I do think you can. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like 100% of Englewood church members moved back into the Englewood neighborhood. That's not the case. I think that's probably a little more than 2/3, maybe 75% now with our membership today. But man, there have just been so many retired aged men and women who have just lived in their homes, 5 or 6 miles away for 50 or 60 years. And that home is dear to them, and that's where they've raised their kids, etc. But they wake up at 6 a.m., they drive in, and they plant themselves in the church office or in the auditorium, or help unclog toilets, or watch kids in kind of the daycare, etc., and make incredible contributions to kind of who we are each day. But they're not Englewood neighborhood residents, and that doesn't make them second-class Englewood church members or their contributions less than, etc. And I think, as we've seen over 27 years too, it doesn't mean that just because a family moves into the neighborhood, they're super engaged, or they're listening, or their relationships are good and sound, etc. So again, it's always more nuanced, it's always more complicated. But on balance, I think we've seen that for those who are willing to move into proximity with one another and with other neighbors, on balance, I think you are more able to develop a genuine and a real sort of community that bears fruit over time. And so, again, I am certainly not going to say how other churches should do things, etc. But again, we're a little allergic at Englewood to kind of boiling anything down to replicable, scalable, etc. But I really do think there are some best practices that we ought to be attentive to and can hold on to.
I feel like I should lean into that. Can you just name those best practices? But I want to hold it because I want to follow this thread around
Yeah.
relationships. Like, it seems to me so much of your work, it's been responsive because you were living with people. You saw the issues, you saw the needs of the neighborhood. And we've talked about housing, but I wonder if you could talk about the PR Mallory.
Yeah. Well, this certainly gets toward being kind of overwhelming in scale, but you've asked, and so I'll tell. And this is work that we're very proud of. But the PR Mallory Corporation was a Fortune 500 company that was born more than 100 years ago and had its global headquarters at 3029 East Washington Street, right in the heart of the Englewood neighborhood. And that company would employ 1,500 persons, both within our neighborhood, the broader community, right? And it was kind of the center of economic and social life for the Englewood neighborhood. I'd say from maybe 1920 to kind of 1965 or so. PR Mallory is the home of the Duracell battery. It's where the Duracell battery was patented. A lot of household appliances and kind of base engineering for household appliances are essentially PR Mallory technology. So just a big job creator and anchor in our neighborhood that by 1965 or so was starting to come unraveled as a company. By maybe 1980 or so was completely defunct and dead and sat vacant, 15 acres, maybe a handful of buildings in the heart of our neighborhood as a vacant, dilapidated eyesore, brownfield, etc. So for the better part of the last, 15 or so years, there have been citywide conversations about what should happen, could happen with the PR Mallory campus. And we've been party to those conversations for many, many years, have taken a couple of different attempts to try to pull some of the pieces together for a credible and community-centered reuse of that campus. And kind of the stars started to align in maybe 2016, 17 or so, as we'd built some capacity and some credibility. And frankly, just because of the support for some of my time and some of our staff's time, we just had a little bit more time to devote to trying to put some of those pieces together. So I'll fast forward and just kind of say, in 2020 or so, we were able to cut the ribbon on about a $38 million redevelopment of that historic campus as a mixed-use campus, which is now the home of Purdue Polytechnic High School, which is a partnership with Purdue University and their efforts to create kind of a majority, minority, and low-income serving charter school, kind of in the heart of our neighborhood, and then sort of a feeder STEM-centered school as part of Paramount Schools of Excellence. Those two schools anchor the historic kind of administrative building on that campus, and then there's a second building where we've had a social enterprise located in time, and Purdue Polytechnic's state champion robotics team kind of calls as their headquarters too. So it's pretty cool. We've been able to be the co-owner and the property manager for that campus and the developer for that campus, along with our local community center that are sort of like 50-50 partners with us. So it's a powerful partnership, not just with a university like Purdue, but certainly our local community center. And it's really brought a lot of life back to kind of the very center of our neighborhood in ways that we're really, really proud of.
I mean, it is so impressive, but also you were seeing, like, if I remember correctly, it's like actually the need for different education opportunities for people in the neighborhood and the opportunity that brought for partnership with Purdue.
Yeah. I mean, it's wonderful. A lot of our friends have intentionally kind of joined their staff at Purdue Polytechnic High School, and my brother Josh has been on their staff from the very beginning. And we all live on kind of the same street, about a block away from this school and 3 blocks away from where I'm talking to you kind of now. And so, because of those relationships and those partnerships, and it gives us the opportunity to maybe do some different things to supplement kind of the education that happens in the classroom. And so earlier this year, I should say, we completed 40 home development specifically for those school families. And so just recognizing that so many of our lower income school families are caught in this sort of eviction loop where every 6 months they're moving, and there's just no way for kids to have this stability to learn, in that environment. So these 40 homes are specifically for those families. They're within 2 or 3 blocks of that school building, and it gives them a chance to live in the neighborhood where their school is located. It gives their parents a chance to really keep them to be involved in their kids' education, after school meetings, activities, etc. And we've just kind of seen that as best practices from other partners in terms of kind of reducing mobility of students, etc. So fun projects like that are sort of affordable housing, which is kind of what we've gotten good at, to kind of layer into projects like kind of that school campus. Pretty fun stuff.
You're describing building things, developing property, partnering with universities, all kinds of pretty significant community development work. What do you say to folks that would ask, why is that the church's work to do?
Well, I think I'm in a Friday morning class or Bible study, kind of going through Jesus parables, and my goodness, Jesus parables are the stuff of this world. I mean, they are about houses, and they are about food, and that is about clothing, and it's about fishermen and carpenters, etc. And so the stuff of this world, I think, is what the church is called to kind of be a part of God's reconciliation. It's the reconciliation of all things, which includes just materiality, which is our flesh and what's around us. And so I just hate to see the work of God so narrowly channeled to the stuff of the spiritual or the idea realm, etc., because that's just not Jesus. It just isn't. Now, those things are important, and how we think certainly impacts kind of the practices that we hold, but the practices that we hold really, really influence day after day the ideas that we have too. And so it's kind of a both and thing. But I don't certainly want to just sort of say it's only about big affordable housing developments or big school properties, because it isn't that either. It really is about relationships, and it really is about friendships that we nurture over multiple decades. And just how those sort of hold us even in kind of our darkest hours. And so, man, I yearn for a church that has the imagination that all those things can be true at one time, and that we can kind of find ways to lean into working on some appropriately scaled projects in and around our neighborhoods that that bear some good fruit over time.
Mm-hmm.
One thing though, just as we kind of talk about relationship, going back to Shannon's earlier question before I launched into kind of PR Mallory stuff, I think one thing that has been important for us though is, early on we were introduced to a body of different ideas and readings, and then real relationships with churches and church communities around the country and around the world that probably lean a little bit more like intentional Christian community, and not just having a very casual church membership with very casual commitments to one another, as most folks change their church membership like they change their socks. We just knew that we were starting to believe that the commitments that we have as members of one another, Ephesians 4 kinds of stuff, that the relationships that we have together are like members of a body, are being ligamented together in a physical body, and that our relationships within Englewood Church need to be as close and as healthy as my relationship with my left arm to my left shoulder. And that was pretty different than what many of us grew up thinking about church membership and relationships, etc. So getting to know other intentional Christian communities that were common purse communities where, some of our friends had a Bruderhof community, etc., or a Reba place up in Evanston and Chicago area. They've committed everything to one another, to the church, to kind of a fellowship there. Englewood Christian Church is not a common purse community in that way. But for myself, there's a lot there that I think we can learn, and more right in those communities than wrong in those communities. And so we've certainly been heavily influenced by a version of church membership that is more high commitment and is more kind of a stronger ecclesiology of what a church should be. And so, Chris Smith, who's part of Englewood CDC, kind of leads the Englewood Review of Books, has written a number of books like Slow Church and How the Body of Christ Talks, etc. A lot of what Chris writes about are similar themes, because we just really believe that that's important. And so I think one thing that we certainly would say to churches that are trying to do this work, that kind of relationship building, commitment to one another, trust building, that for us happened in slow week after week conversations on Sunday night where we just gathered the chairs up in a circle and have had just one slow 40-year conversation about our life and the life of our neighborhood. Those things are essential if you're just going to hang with one another for a long period of time, and through just, the kinds of changes that you see in a dynamic neighborhood over 3 decades. You just have to have, I think, a stronger commitment to one another and to place.
You're describing a relationship, a sort of spiritual relationship between this community development work and the church. It's so embedded. I mean, it's not, it's sort of a side project. It's not just this thing over here that a few people are thinking about. I mean, it's really very much a part of the church's DNA at this point, and the church's identity, the church's sense of purpose. Can you talk a little bit though about practically and kind of legally, how is that set up, right? And you referenced the Englewood CDC, Community Development Corporation. What is a CDC for those that aren't familiar, and then what is sort of the relationship between that and the church itself?
Yeah. No, sure. Englewood Community Development Corporation, which is the CDC, Community Development Corporation. There are community development corporations around the country, they really focus on place-based development. Most community development corporations focus certainly on affordable housing, and then again, I think best practices are really to care about comprehensive community development, and so you care about a lot of other things too, even if you don't directly do them. Most community development corporations have kind of a catchment area or geography that they work within. Ours is sort of the Near East Side or the 46201 zip code, but we certainly give preference to our kind of Englewood neighborhood, which is maybe one of 20 or so Near East Side neighborhoods as part of the Near East Side. It is a separate 501c3, separate not-for-profit from Englewood Christian Church, but very intentionally tied in terms of our bylaws to the church, in terms of the about 2/3 of our board members are from Englewood Church. That's actually been revised down a little bit, as the initial bylaws called for 100% of the board members to be from the church. We certainly have felt like over the years that we certainly want to maintain that connection to the church through certainly board members and some other ways that we're connected, including just being physically present with our offices within the church building. But we've certainly loosened some of those things to just allow some other streams of knowledge and relationship in from outside of our congregation, and could certainly talk about how that's gone over the years and different learnings kind of there. But essentially a separate not-for-profit connected in some very real ways, both in our bylaws, but in just sort of daily practice of just physically being located kind of here. And then always trying to say to our church that, we'd love for more of church members to consider some of the work that we're trying to do as a community development corporation as an opportunity for them, as a staff member. That is a very, very small fraction of our 175 or so church members, but it's a meaningful one. Again, a shift though is just the reality is that I'd say now it's only maybe 50% of our staff are from kind of the Englewood Christian Church, and another 50% are from other congregations or from folks that just have no affiliation or walk with Jesus. And we think that's okay, and we think that's good. But we certainly want to continue to say, hey, we really believe that loving your neighbor as we love ourselves is the North Star. It is the common ground. And with folks that are from a different faith persuasion that join our staff, or for partnerships that we have in the community, that's a non-negotiable. We just really, really believe that, regardless of who you worship or what you worship, that's the common ground for good stuff to happen. Because certainly I think we all see within ourselves or within other organizations, if the agenda is just sort of my agenda, it just doesn't take long for those relationships to be strained and pulled apart. And so trying to kind of emphasize that, even as we do really wrestle with kind of some of the changes that come with a neighborhood that's very changing.
So, Joe, a lot of people that listen to this podcast are pastors, and they might be starting to get a vision for, we could do something with our land. We could do something that makes a difference here. But as pastors begin to think about how to step into this work, or what their role is in the neighborhood, and how to lead their congregation to a new imagination, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly encourage it, but I think I would certainly encourage those pastors to find other folks in their congregation to have those conversations with, for this to be a true movement of the church and not just sort of a vision of one man or one woman. I think we, in the work that we're now doing through Cultivating Communities, which is really just an intentional effort of Englewood CDC to say, hey, we want to walk with other churches that want to do this kind of work. I think we've certainly seen some best practices when that base is broad at the beginning, versus the pastor, getting way on down the road and then trying to talk community members or congregational members into a vision that they have, etc. So would absolutely encourage it. Also recognize that pastors are persons with real influence and vision, and it's important for them to share those visions. But again, a staple for us at Englewood is the discernment of the body, and it's mutual discernment. And so there are so many ideas that I have every single day that are just bad ideas, or they're ideas where their time hasn't come yet. And I need folks around Englewood to say, Joe, we hear you. We love your passion, but that's maybe, but we're maybe just not all there yet, and I got to be able to hear that. And again, my commitment to this community has to be strong enough that I can sometimes just be told, that's just not the best idea for where we are right now, or that's too much too soon. So you kind of need that vision, and you need those folks that will stir the pot a little bit, and you don't want to thwart that, but you also want to say, hey, for this to be healthy for the long term, it has to be a movement of the church and a discernment of the body, not a discernment of the left arm,
Okay, you've mentioned best practices a few times, and I love that phrase. It's got to be broad at the base. But what are the few best practices you think these are essential?
Well, I said this a little bit earlier, and again, I don't have any written down set of best practices, so this is a little bit extemporaneous. But I do think, I kind of mentioned this earlier, I think as churches are moving into kind of neighborhood spaces, man, really do that humbly, really do that with a listening posture, and really try to take, I would say, several years, if you can do it, to really just understand the context, the language, how others are making contributions. So I think that's an important thing. There's enough to do inside our churches to kind of build community and to build unity for some things that I don't think you have to jump into your first neighborhood meeting or community meeting kind of guns a-blazing. I think you ought to kind of take your time there. I think another one would just be kind of paying attention to the transitions and the shape of your congregation. And again, just kind of build that broad base and some understanding. And so there's a piece of paper that I'm looking at here that talk about 25 or so different transitions that we've seen happen at Englewood. Transitioning from a religious institution to a real community, from an economics mindset of scarcity to superabundance, and just a lot of things like that I think if we're attentive to kind of how we're thinking, where we're moving, I think we'll probably have some better outcomes, certainly, for sure. I mentioned it earlier, maybe as one other one, finding some practical ways to enter into some neighborhood work or to do some kind of work together inside the church that are appropriately scaled and participatory, that really do engage folks with the gifts that they have, in ways that really show them a different side of the church and a different side of themselves to give in some ways that maybe they've never been asked to give within a church context before. And I think that just opens up so much creativity. I had coffee this morning with a lady in the church who works in media, and we are not a very media savvy congregation. But there are some ways that she can kind of help, and that maybe we've not utilized her gifts kind of to the fullest extent possible. So I think those things are important too. Those are three or so that immediately come to mind.
Those are great. Those are great. And I mean, we see very similar things in the churches that we've worked with or that have kind of been, quote unquote.
Well, we've certainly utilized some tools that you guys have developed along these lines, but I think simple things, simple within community development context, like asset mapping, that our cultivating communities teams are now doing those with churches in so many different places. And those really seem to open up brand new possibilities and vistas for people that of just kind of saying, hey, who are we as a church? Who are we as members? What are our professional capacities, our hobbies, our passions, etc. And to what extent are those needed within our surrounding kind of neighborhoods and communities in ways that are maybe just sitting latent in a church organization that seems to only care about offerings or a few kind of very narrow committee ministries, etc. There's just so much more that's possible with the folks that are in our congregations.
So we're going to, as we sort of move towards wrapping up, we want to ask a few kind of rapid fire questions, quick responses. We've been doing this with each of our guests, just to kind of get your kind of gut reaction to these things. So to start that off, what is one thing you wish people in the pew knew about this kind of work?
I think a lot of people see it as certainly hard work, and there's certainly a level of commitment and sacrifice. But man, I just think of it like, for myself, I'll just say I'm just so richly blessed to be able to kind of do this kind of work. And it feels like finding that treasure hidden in the field, just to be able to come each day into the church building, into an office with 30 or so folks at Englewood Community Development Corporation that have real work to do in supporting our neighbors and supporting neighborhood. And that is identified as part of the church's expression of who we are, in ways that just aren't so churchy. It's just a wonderful gift, and it's been life-giving for me. I think it has caused, I've over doing this, kind of work for 30 or so years. I've given up some things. Like I don't golf. We don't go on a lot of, big lavish vacations or have a summer home or whatever. So there certainly are some things that you kind of give up that are dreams of yours that you're just not going to probably fulfill. But it's sort of like, Jesus' words, for he who gives up, kind of mother, sister, brother, father, won't receive 100 times more. Aunts and uncles and new family and new friends, etc. And I've just seen that, and I think others around Englewood have seen that. That's pretty cool. So again, I really do think there is that superabundance, but I don't think we get to that superabundance by trying to get the superabundance. It's a weird thing. Jesus is pretty deep.
Okay, so another rapid fire question. A lot of this work is partnership work. You have to work with the city government, other organizations. Yep. What's one thing you wish people in the city government knew about churches doing this work?
That a couple different things can be true, as they probably know. They've seen it done very poorly, and they've seen it as a strategy to proselytize or to build a kingdom for themselves or reputation for kind of church folks, etc. And again, that's all pretty ugly. And a lot of folks in our city government have seen that, and other city governments have seen that. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think we've discovered so many dozens of congregations, particularly African American congregations, that are serving in some beautiful ways, humble ways in their neighborhoods, that are about this kind of work for the right reasons. And those reasons are congruent with the kind of work that a lot of city government folks and other public kind of sector leaders are looking for. And those things are equity, and those things are economic empowerment and quality of life, etc. And so, for years and years, we were scared to death of interactions with persons from the city, persons from the state, and really just kind of saw them as the enemy. And now, again, there are still times where we want to pull our hair out, or where we're not in kind of complete alignment with some of our friends within city government, etc. But those relationships can be mutually supporting, etc.
Yeah. That's great. If you could go back to yourself, 20 years ago when you were starting out in this work, what's one thing you wish you knew then that you know now?
Well, I think the way that I thought about a lot of this work when I was younger, especially in a neighborhood that was considered a bad neighborhood, is there is kind of the adventure of it, and it's sort of like there's a little bit of a kind of look what we're doing for God, or look what we're doing to live in a neighborhood that's a bad neighborhood and to raise a family here. And, I know that's how I thought or would often think about kind of my life and that work then. And it's funny because I don't read as much Wendell Berry as I used to probably then, but now I think of it probably more in like Wendell Berry terms, in terms of just like, this is just home, and this is where we've committed ourselves, and we've we've kind of developed real ties, and that really do hold us and bind us. And so I think of it more like just kind of working with my friends and neighbors for the benefit of my home community more than I do a sort of kind of a Jesus radical, look what I'm doing for Jesus kind of a posture. So I wished I'd have I wished I'd have been a little less excited or excitable then, or mature in some ways then.
Okay, finally, we're asking all of our guests this season one question. As you consider the reality of the world and the witness of the church in this moment, what is your hope for the church?
A broader imagination, for kind of like what we talked about earlier. I think from doing community development work for 25 or 30 years, I've had my mind changed so many times, but I think the one thing that I've just seen to be true time and time again is that all things hold together in Jesus, both at the start, in the middle, and at the end. And that's just not magic from saying the name of Jesus. That is just sort of the reality as we prefer others to ourselves, which is the way of Jesus. Transformation happens in business, transformation happens in education, transformation happens in housing and neighborhoods, etc. And that is the common denominator at the base or at the nucleus of every community development project, to the extent there was love of neighbor toward the center, at the center of it. Health seems to flow. And that's it. Like it all kind of flows out of that, which is just a long way of saying, like, I really think this Jesus stuff is important, and I really think that our churches have this responsibility to be demonstration plots of what's possible in the way of Jesus. And they seem often so committed to so much that's toxic and phony and rubbish, when so many of our other partners that are secular partners seem to be more committed to loving neighbor as self. And it's a weird time. But again, we're people that really believes that God's manifold wisdom was to make, kind of intent was to make his manifold wisdom known through the church. And that happens in some strange ways. But we want to hold on to that and work with the church to see that through, because we really believe that that's still God's wisdom.
Oh, that's great. Oh, Joe, thank you so much for being on with us today. You've just been pioneering in this work for so long, and we're really grateful for you and the work of Englewood Church and Englewood CDC.
Well, thank you, Shannon and Mark. And again, like I get asked to do stuff like this from time to time and speak into a microphone, etc. But again, like, I'm just so lucky to have 30 or so folks that work with me, and I've just kind of seen past generations pour themselves out and do this kind of work. And so it's fun for me to kind of get to talk and say some of these things, but it really is a broad base of folks that are doing some pretty cool work. And I'm glad to just be part of that stream.
Yeah, well, many blessings to you and to all those people, and to the legacy that has gone into where you're at. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.